To bind off on your 2 at a time toe-up socks, you're going to need to do a little trick on the second sock. So basically, you're going to need to finish your first sock, and how do you get around with the second sock in the way, right? So here's going to be the trick for binding off on your toe-up socks. Basically, you'll need to get these last stitches. You'll save them, and I'll show you how to do that. So I'm going to bind off with Jeny's Surprisingly Stretchy Bind Off. But this will also work for the invisible rib bind off or any bind off that you're going to do. That's the same trick. So to start with Jeny's Surprisingly Stretchy Bind Off, we do a backwards yarn over right before the first knit stitch, and then we bind that stitch off. We do a regular yarn over before the purl stitch. And this is the same whether you're a continental knitter or an American style knitter. And I have a detailed video on how to do Jeny's Surprisingly Stretchy Bind Off, but this is just an example. So we're just going to start, whoops, I dropped that stitch there. No problem. So we're just going to start working away, binding off across this 1 by 1 rib. Before a purl stitch, there's a regular yarn over, we bind it off, and then bind off the second stitch. And then a knit stitch coming up, we do a backwards yarn over. So the main idea is to do whatever bind off you do, whether it's the invisible ribbed bind off, you'll be using your tapestry needle and sewing along. Whoops, there we go, regular yarn over. You'll be doing a knit off purl, purl off knit, right? But you're going to have the same, bound off edge coming off your needles there. It's a little, even hard for me to keep track of the regular yarn overs or the backwards yarn overs, just doing too many things at once. Okay. As I said, backwards yarn over, there we go. And bind off. We have a regular yarn over, yep, before a purl stitch. A backwards yarn over. Alright, so we're getting to the end here. This is the most exciting part of the video. This is the trick, is on these last few stitches. So when you're using Jeny's Surprisingly Stretchy Bind Off or any other knitted bind off, you're going to get to the very last stitches and you're not going to be able to finish because you still need to finish the other half of the sock, right? So you'll get to the very last stitch in this case. This is as far as you can go. Whoops, I dropped that stitch, so we're just going to start again. Yarn over, okay, and bind off those last two. So this is as far as we can go right now. We can't get to the other stitches because there's another sock in the way. So that's fine. So what we're going to do, and if it's the invisible rib bind off, you're going to have 2 stitches left, and I think they're going to be on the left needle. That's okay. Just move them over to the right needle. Okay, they'll be on the left needle. Just slip them to the right needle for safekeeping, like that. And then you're going to do the second sock. Okay. So it's the same idea. We're saving the last stitches that we can't finish yet, so we have all those live stitches still, and then this bound off edge. So what we're going to do now is the same thing on the first half of the second sock. And I'm not going to make you watch all of the binding off because it's the same idea, but this one it's just basically like binding off one sock. You're going to go all the way around the whole sock, binding off. I will show you what happens when we get to the other side. Make sure you got plenty of yarn there. Oh, my yarn is sticking to me. There we go. We always want to make sure that we have plenty of yarn pulled out of the yarn ball so that it doesn't mess up our tension. Alright, a backwards yarn over, a regular yarn over, and we are finished with the first half of the second sock. Now in this case, it looks just like the first sock. Drop your empty left needle, turn your needles around, and then hold on to everything with your left hand while with your right hand you just feed the needle back into the stitches. Make sure your working yarn comes between the needle tips and over the back. So now you're basically in ready position. This should look very familiar. And then instead of pulling the back needle out of the stitch, what you're going to want to do is just turn the needle with the stitch on it. So now it's like you're knitting one continuous line of stitches. You're binding this off without any interruption at all. So we have a knit stitch coming up, so you'll do a backwards yarn over, and you'll just continue binding off, and then we're using that last stitch from the first half to continue binding off, and there's no interruption. So yeah, we're going to finish the rest of this sock. Make sure you have plenty of yarn. We're going to finish binding off the rest of this sock, and I'll show you what that looks like at the end of this row. Don't you wish all your knitting was as easy as this, right? Just crossfade to the last few stitches? No, then we miss all the fun. So we're approaching the very last stitch, and I actually have a trick that I'll share with you as well. I'm not going to show it to you here, but it's about how to neaten the very last stitch, because we have come to the end of the round, and to make the last stitch right here link up nicely with the first stitch, I have a trick for that. So I'll give you a link to that trick. But there you've bound off the first sock, and you can just use some scissors, which you should have handy. If you're not the Incredible Hulk, just, wow, this yarn is really sturdy. Use some scissors and cut your yarn, leave your 6-inch tail, and just feed the tail through that last stitch. And so we finished that one. Like I said, you can just Google Knit Freedom how to neaten the last stitch of your bind off in the round, but I'll also give you a link next to this video. So now look what we've got left. We've got one sock and a big mess of needles. So just straighten your needle out. We want one long loop, and we want stitches on the needle tips. So the single stitch goes in your right hand, and the unbound off stitches go in your left hand, and now you have one continuous row of knitting. You can keep binding off, and that's how you bind off on your 2 at a time project.